Hi, welcome to Vantage Point. You're watching a special session on the sideline of a very, very important conference that looks at transformation, but this time transformation of the laws that we have. Are they, very much in the 1950s or the 1957, right up to the early years of independence, that they sometimes we look at them as not being really relevant to the changes that we want happening in our society right now. And one area in particular that I want to discuss today with my great guest that I have today is about how do we balance the need for example, national security vis-a-vis the freedom of the individual, or be it the freedom of the community in general. So I'm very glad today and honored to have Professor Stephen Vladeck, the Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Scholarship, American University Washington College of Law, at my far left, and of course, near to me, we always have this affinity with Europe football or otherwise, Mr. Jeremy McBride, Chairman of the Scientific Community, European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency. Especially lately, in the world where the word terrorism is very familiar across the world, we have no choice but to live in this world with more imposition that a lot of people look upon as limiting what they used to have in terms of freedom and ability to do what they want as an individual or community. However, one of the things that was mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, where it's not just looking at the law in terms of national security, but it's also the obligation of the state to really ensure that every citizen is safe. If I look at EU and America, this has been discussed for a very, very long time. So maybe I can go to the EU's experience of this first, because you look at a lot of countries.
Yeah.
So if you can give us your wisdom on that.
Well, of course, the risk of power is always oppression. I think that everyone is clear about that. And Europe is no different from anywhere else. So when you have strong measures which the state may take, then there's always going to be a fear. And that's why if you look at the debates in many European countries when legislation was adopted, they weren't just passed. I think if you go back perhaps to the 1970s when there was the emergency in Northern Ireland, the laws were passed too quickly. Some laws were passed in a matter of hours, and the consequences were very serious because actually exacerbated the situation rather than solved it. So I think you need to ensure that when you give powers that you have proper controls in place, and that I think is where the focus is very much now in Europe. And in Europe we are fortunate in one sense that in addition to national controls, we also have the operation of the European Court of Human Rights, yes, which allows people to challenge some judgments which are made domestically. So you have two levels really of protection.
Please indulge me, because as a journalist, when I look at the title that you have, Chairman of the Scientific Committee, but it's a fundamental rights agency.
Yeah. In
these parts of the world, if you say scientific committee, possibly you look at physics, biology, or nanotechnology for once.
Well, I should emphasize, my normal job is as a barrister, so this is an additional activity. The scientific committee there is to vet the quality of the work done by the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is looking at a range of human rights problems in the European Union. Yeah. And that includes not only legal analysis, but also empirical work. So there's a need
that's
to
the reason I ask, because sometimes maybe we forget that there are ways to really put in safeguards and make it very clear and transparent with a metric on the sidelines to measure. Because a lot of people look at the intangible side of law sometimes, and we debate about the interpretation of it. But let's go to America now. And it's quite difficult for me to ask you about human rights and everything else. But for the layman out there, a lot of the times, speeches by any leaders from America, whatever it is being said, to them, as long as they're still Guantanamo standing, it's more than 100 people in Guantanamo still, then everything else is like...
Well, I think it's a fair point. Guantanamo has been, and I think it still is, a stain. Not just on the reputation of the United States when it comes to human rights, but on the ability of the United States to serve as a leader, not just in our own practices, but in promoting, better and more tolerant practices around the world. So, I think it's important to keep in mind how limited Guantanamo is. As we were discussing this morning, It only has been used for individuals captured on battlefields outside the United States, non-citizens. No one who has been arrested in the United States has been sent there.
Yes.
And indeed, it's a dwindling population. No one new has been sent there since 2006. But that doesn't change the fact that it's still there.
Okay.
And I think it's the paradox for the United States is how to continue to hold itself out as the model for how a progressive democracy should handle the tension between civil liberties and national security, while continuing to perpetuate this, I think, very, very unfortunate example of times when that balance is wrongly struck.
There are other names being put out, maybe due to Hollywood sometimes, the Patriot Act, the Homeland Security, for example. But in your presentation, you also say there's a lot that has been learned through negative things that had happened. For example, during World War II, then the internment of the Japanese American. For you, that has make the whole system have a check upon itself and really look at what improvements can be done. If you put that same perspective onto what has happened after 9/11, how would you find the silver linings out of that?
Well, I mean, I think we've already learned some silver linings, and I think we'll learn others as time goes on. I mean, it took us a generation to realize the mistakes we made with regard to internment. But as my colleague puts it, I think part of it is understanding the importance of legislating in advance. Okay. So you mentioned the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was passed just 6 weeks after 9/11. While the Twin Towers were literally still smoldering.
Yes.
And I think, although I don't think it's nearly as bad as it's often made out to be, I think it's an example of how legislation passed in the aftermath of an emergency is not always as well calibrated or precise as we'd like it to be. In contrast, I mean, the legislation in the United States that responded to the internment camps, which was passed not during an emergency, which was passed during a purely ordinary time, has really persevered as a ban on the same kind of thing from ever repeating. Okay. So, I think if there's a silver lining here, it's that we have learned from our mistakes in a way that means with each next mistake, we'll make a different mistake, but hopefully we won't make the same mistake twice. And so I think one of the things we've learned after 9/11 is just how important vigorous judicial review can be, and how important it can be not just directly in ruling for parties in these cases, but indirectly in influencing policy.
Well, it only has been 55 years for Malaysia since independence. So hold that thought. I have to go for the first commercial. Hi, thank you for still watching Vantage Point. I'm still here on the sidelines of a very important conference on transformation of laws to really accommodate the wishes of the people and aspirations of development that we have right now. So we'd like to go to America and EU and learn the wisdom that has been learned, especially in terms of balancing human rights and also security for the nation and state, taking into consideration the imperative of a very plural society. So maybe if I can go to EU first, because lately we've been hearing about the rise of the far right, and the far right political movement have even been elected into legislative bodies, whether in EU or in respective countries. So even in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, when issues like burning of the Quran, where the right of religion of one particular minority section is weighted against the right and safety and security of a nation. So how would, from an EU's perspective, you would look at this? Because this is a growing concern. It's
a growing concern, but it's also something which there are big efforts to try and resist. I mean, it comes from two things which are related, I suppose. One, within the European Union, you have concern about immigration. And therefore the effect, particularly in the times of the economic crisis where there aren't necessarily employment, that's one factor. But the other factor is that society is changing. You mentioned that we're multicultural, and that's for sure. But for some people that is something they want to resist. Yes. And so yes, there have been some public support, but at the same time you see very strong measures being adopted to ensure that equality is protected, and also strong action is taken against incitement to hatred. it's a big responsibility not only for the law, but it's also for politicians. I think one of the areas of concern still is that some politicians are not strong enough in speaking out against intolerance. And that's really where a lot of effort still needs to be made.
And you have to do that across many countries.
Well, I don't personally. I mean, a whole range of people do. But I mean, one of the things that the Fundamental Rights Agency demonstrates is the weaknesses of the application of law in practice, because there are difficulties. I mean, in Europe, equality is, well, the standards are very high. But one of the difficulties is people don't actually always use the law as well as they should. And so trying to address that is of fundamental importance.
Awareness of the Constitution is one of the basic things that people will keep relating back. The other one is the history of what's been put into the Constitution. You must understand the original context for it to be more forward into the future. But especially for a supranational entity like EU, isn't it difficult to leverage across an average from north right up until south, for example?
There is, but the difficulty with the European Union faces, I think, is that it's been constructed in a way not from below but from above, which is therefore a difficulty for people appreciating the value that it has. I think it has enormous value, but there is a problem of ensuring that people fully appreciate that, which comes back also to what people in Europe talking about the democratic deficit, because there isn't sufficient popular involvement in the European Union.
Yes. We go to America now because Professor is here, and especially after 9/11, words or brands like Islam or Asians, maybe have a different connotation as compared to before 9/11. How would you look at national security imperative? At the same time, maybe it's a golden opportunity, or is still a golden opportunity, to really foster better understanding. However, what will be the provisions of law, do you think, in your point of view, that people should be really looking at, rather than just looking at what it prohibits, but also what it opens up opportunities for?
Well, I mean, I think, it's entirely natural, if regrettable, right, that 9/11 prompted a resurgence of racism in the United States, especially racism directed toward Muslims or individuals of Arab descent. But I think despite some initial negative reactions, overall, the equality landscape over the past decade has actually been pretty good in the United States. We've made some mistakes, but I think the two principles that have survived, that predated 9/11 and have really sort of reemerged as guiding forces in our legal culture is, anti-discrimination, which, has not always been America's best example, but certainly over the last 45 years or so has been really one of the centerpieces of American constitutional law. And neutrality. And neutrality, I think, really shows up in the context of speech, and sort of the view that the government's regulation of what is said should not depend on who is saying it, should not depend on the content of the message. Otherwise, it looks like the government is suppressing speech based upon your background, your viewpoint, your religion. And so, I think those have both taken a little bit of a beating since 9/11, but come back strong. So that today, the laws the United States has passed dealing with virtually every aspect of counterterrorism are neutral. And with one important exception, which is that some of the laws apply to non-citizens differently. They're non-discriminatory, at least insofar as anyone, citizen or non, Muslim or Christian, black or white, can be held to the same standards, can be punished for the same conduct, is protected also from the same private violence.
Sorry to cut you, but if I go back to the fundamentals of the American Constitution, the perception of land of the free, which is enshrined into freedom of speech, of assembly, and in the presentation of the concurrent session, when you're giving your remarks on the topic of peaceful assembly, you make a point that even for the freedom of speech, the content of the speech cannot make somebody who's going to deliver that speech be discriminated against. For example, that's how true to freedom of speech that's being looked upon by the enforcement of laws, for example, or provisions of law by the Supreme Court undertaking. So how do you look at that? Because maybe in some other countries where we don't have that advantage, the perception of the land of the free and the most foremost guarded religiously, freedom of speech and everything else, would you see the difference? Because we're trying to benchmark here.
Well, that's not to say that we do it right. I mean, I think the American model is to protect speech first and foremost, including hateful speech, including speech that can be at times insightful and incite others to violence. And obviously that can sometimes be in tension when that speech is especially, along racial or religious lines. I think the American view, for better or for worse, is that better to protect the speech even that we hate, even if it means giving a microphone to viewpoints that really should not be allowed in rational public discourse, than to have the government in the position of playing censor.
But it's not a zero-sum game. If I understand from your presentation, if a group goes to the funeral of an American serviceman, that's the body just flown back, the family just wanted to have peace and closure. But then there's this fiery speech at the same time. You can't stop the speech, but you can ask the state and their responsibility to actually govern that outpouring of freedom of speech.
That's right, and so the balance that the U.S. tries to strike and not always strikes, doesn't always strike perfectly, is the government is allowed to impose what are called time, place, and manner restrictions, but those restrictions have to have a very strong justification, and they have to be neutral, which means anyone who wants to speak at that time, in that place, in that manner, must abide by the same restrictions, or else it looks like the government's playing favorites.
Maybe the problem is that the problem is now that the world is so global that when I travel to America, a lot of what shapes my view and action will be from what the environment that I came from dictated. For example, if I've been taught that you just can't say this about religion, about your own religion, that's sacred. But on the other hand, there I stand, and I will be hearing people blasting my religion. So in this part of the world, that cannot be tolerated. But in a world that's very, very much converging, how do you look at that for us to govern internationally? Because somebody drawing some cartoon of the Prophet somewhere in Europe will see people being killed out here in Southeast Asia.
Well, and I think that's, that is the, if I may say, that is the price we pay for free speech, which is the speech will prompt reactions. The speech will, unfortunately sometimes prompt violence. And it shouldn't be so. Obviously the hope is that speech will only further discourse.
Okay.
And that, those who have resorted to violence, for example, when the Mohammed cartoons were published, would instead resort to the airwaves. But I think the choice that the United States has made time and again, not always for better, has been speech first, restrictions later.
All right. I have to go for the last commercial break, but once we are back, I want to talk about judicial control, because that's very key in your presentations. But also look at this particular issue whereby more and more human rights is also being linked to trade and the ability to foster better wealth creation in between nations. So it's not just anymore the issue of freedom and rights, but it's an issue of it might hamper me trying to bring up the quality of life for a nation, for example. So how do you look at that and discuss that after this short break? You want your rights, but your rights cannot supersede the nation's right to give peace and also security to every citizen. But in that respect, if I look at it from a multinational or country-to-country international perspective, more and more is being linked to other things, like the ability to have trade or special trade agreements. So how do you look at that? Because what is sacred for the United States of America might be the cause of riots in Malaysia, because we just don't allow that to be said in between different religious groups, for example. So how do you see that? Because we have to govern this at the international level, because this is the precedent set. Like you said, we must legislate for the future.
I think that's the hardest question in national security these days is how to sort of adapt these policies so that they fit into different regimes. I don't know what the right answer is. I think a lot of it's just going to be slow, steady movement, hopefully toward one common set of goals. But the one thing I'm comfortable saying and confident in is the answer cannot be the lowest common denominator. where whichever country is the, whatever sort of standard will offend the fewest people is the one we apply. I mean, that can't be the governing rule. I think it has to be one that's more based on promoting democratic values, promoting the ability of individuals to express themselves, and just making sure that expression, doesn't interfere with the rights of others to the same liberties.
But at the end of the day, even though we know about separation of power, the executive will have to carry a lot of things out in terms, especially governing the enforcement. And you have mentioned where, if there's political will, the ability to push through what's right, even though it will not be popular. In the case of Guantanamo, to close, it's not impossible to close Guantanamo, but there's a lot of things to be considered from the political standpoint. Your point?
I mean, I think that's right, and I think this is, it's going to take not just President Obama in the United States, but leaders around the world realizing that, especially in this area, popular prejudices are going to get in the way of ordinary democratic reform, and that there's going to be a real need for top-down leadership, not because these things are easy, but entirely because they are hard, and because they won't be popular, but they are right.
Popular or not is a political question, but if awareness about judicial control, the trust in judicial control, the governance of judicial control, maybe it can help the question on the other side.
But it is very important. I mean, the difficulty you face when just acceding to popular prejudice, which we were discussing, is that is something which needs to be challenged. And whether that's acting on prejudice, whether it's by the population at large or whether it's by the government, doing something to curry political favour, there's need for some controls, and one of the strongest ways of doing that is through the courts, ensuring that the law is actually properly applied and respectful, therefore, of human rights. But that requires a judiciary which has the strength of character and the fortitude to be prepared to challenge those decisions.
And independence.
And independence, indeed. But that also therefore means that you've also got to respect the judiciary, because the judicial function is not there to undermine government, but it is actually there to uphold the Constitution.
Before we end, I've linked it a bit to trade and agreements, and I won't trade with you if you don't improve your human rights record or something like that. But terrorism also cannot just be defined with people with guns and bombs. From the economic terms, if you're going to flood the world with derivative papers that you know is not fundamentally legal and correct in that sense, and then you're going to cause the crash of the economy, which people are going to lose their life because they lose their jobs and they kill themselves. So going forward, do you think that this should be included into the imperative of security also? Because that's also the right of governments to protect citizens from losing everything that you built your life on.
I mean, that's partly what regulation is about, and indeed there are issues there about the whole form of regulation, about whether it destroys things, I mean, whether it affects the environment, and you have to be very careful about how these things develop to ensure that damage is not done. And if the state, for example, does not regulate economic activity in an appropriate fashion, you can end up in that situation. And one would say, for example, in the UK, that perhaps the UK authorities were too relaxed in regulation, which caused a lot of people very serious hardship.
Still no one prosecuted over the subprime crisis. We don't actually really know from a legal standpoint what's happening. Your point of view?
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think part of why I think the 9/11 crisis has receded from the American vantage point is because the economic crisis superseded it. And I think any American who didn't think before 2008 that economic crises were at least as grave a threat to their livelihood as national security crises knows better now. And I think it's understood that national security is not just about individuals with bombs. National security is about protecting the ability of the country to function, which is as much about the ability of economies to function, individuals to pursue their livelihoods, as is about protecting us from bombs and from guns. And I think that's the challenge we face going forward, is how to sort of combine authorities that have historically been understood to be separate.
That's not only for you students of laws in universities, but for all of us. Maybe we should read our constitution better and understand and benchmark that against others and see the practice, because at the end of the day, in the democratic parliamentary process, you go to vote and you influence people who form the 2/3 majorities to change or amend laws. Thank you so much, Professor Vladeck. Thank you so much, Mr. McBride.
Pleasure.
I'll see you in another episode of Vantage Point very, very soon. Until then, goodbye. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, okay.